At 11:15 a.m. on the 9th of June 1903, a green Winton touring car sat motionless on a dirt track in the Nevada desert. The engine was silent. The radiator was empty. The driver, Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson, had just poured the last of his drinking water into the steaming engine to cool it, and now there was nothing left for him or his mechanic, Sewall.This. They had been stranded for over 2 hours. The temperature was above 100 degrees. The nearest settlement was more than 30 miles behind them. They had not seen another person since dawn. Jackson looked at Crocker. There was no shade, no water, no plan. How did they get here? 17 days earlier, on the morning of May 23, 1903, Jackson and Crocker had departed from San Francisco in that same Winton car. Jackson was a 31-year-old doctor from Vermont, a wealthy man with a taste for adventure. Crocker was a mechanic, hired at the last minute because Jackson did not know how to fix a car. The vehicle was a second-hand Winton touring car, painted green, with a 2-cylinder engine and no roof. It had no windscreen, no headlights, no spare tires beyond the 2 they strapped to the back, and no odometer. They carried a rifle, a sleeping bag, a few cans of gasoline, a camera, and a single map that showed only the major railroad lines. The trip was a bet. 2 months earlier, Jackson was at a social club in San Francisco when someone said that automobiles were unreliable, that no one could drive one across the continent. Jackson disagreed. A bet was made, $50, that he could not reach New York City within 90 days. Jackson accepted. He bought the Winton car from a friend, hired Crocker, and left. The first day was deceptively easy. They drove through the streets of San Francisco, crossed the bay on a ferry, and then headed east along the railroad tracks. The roads, such as they were nothing more than wagon trails. In many places, the tracks had disappeared entirely. Jackson and Crocker followed the railroad line because that was the only reliable way to know they were going in the right direction. They stopped often. The car broke down repeatedly. On May 24th, the second day, they covered only 30 miles. The engine overheated in the California sun. The tires punctured on sharp rocks. They had no spare inner tubes. When a tire failed, they had to patch it with rubber cement and hope it held. By May 26th, they reached Sacramento. The journey so far had taken 3 days to cover 90 miles. Jackson wrote a letter to his wife telling her that the roads were terrible and that they were making slow progress. He did not tell her how close they had come to quitting. The car had thrown a connecting rod near Stockton, and Crocker had to repair it with a piece of rope. In Sacramento, they stopped at a hardware store to buy more rope, more inner tubes, and a 5-gallon can of gasoline. They pressed on toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. The road wound upward through thick forest. The Winton car struggled to climb the steep grades. Jackson and Crocker often got out and walked alongside the car to lighten the load. Every few miles, they stopped to let the engine cool. They passed through small towns where people gathered to stare at the green motor car. Some had never seen an automobile. Children ran behind it. Farmers stopped their wagons. Jackson and Crocker were celebrities, but they could not afford to stop long. They crossed the Sierra Nevada at Donner Pass. The descent was dangerous. The brakes on the Winton car were weak and the road was loose gravel. Jackson held the wheel while Crocker stood on the running board and leaned his weight against the car to help it steer. They skidded more than once. At the bottom, they found a stretch of flat land and pushed onto Truckee. There, they bought more gasoline and a bag of ice for the radiator. On June 1st, they reached the Nevada state line. The landscape changed immediately. The green hills of California gave way to brown sagebrush and endless sky. The roads, if they could be called roads, became sand. The Winton car sank into the soft ground. Jackson and Crocker had to dig it out with a shovel. They laid blankets under the wheels to gain traction. The heat was oppressive. They drank water constantly but still felt dehydrated. They had not anticipated that water would be scarce. They carried 2 canteens, each holding about a gallon. By June 3rd, they had emptied both. They stopped at a ranch house and filled the canteens from a well. The rancher warned them that the next water was 60 miles ahead. On June 5th, they left the last outpost of civilization, the town of Golconda, Nevada. The road ahead crossed the Humboldt Sink, a barren salt flat with no shade and no water. Jackson and Crocker drove for hours. The sun was relentless. The car's engine temperature rose dangerously. They poured water into the radiator, but it boiled away almost immediately. By noon on June 6th, they had used all their water. They had to choose, stop and wait for help, which might never come, or drive on and risk destroying the engine. They drove on. The radiator began to steam. The car lurched forward, then stalled. Jackson got out and tried to pour the last of their drinking water into the radiator, but it was only a few cupfuls. It did nothing. They were stuck. At 2:30 p.m. on June 6th, Jackson saw a dust cloud on the horizon. It was a stagecoach coming from the east. The stagecoach driver saw them too. He stopped. Jackson explained that they were out of water and stranded. The driver gave them 2 gallons of water from his own supply. He also told them that there was a spring about 10 miles ahead, but that the road was nearly impassable. Jackson and Crocker poured 1 gallon into the radiator, drank the other, and started the engine. It coughed, then ran. They drove on. They found the spring. It was a shallow pool of muddy water. They filled the canteens and the radiator. They stayed there for an hour, resting in the shade of the car. Then they continued east. On June 9th, they reached the town of Winnemucca. They were exhausted. The car was battered, they had punctured two tires, broken a spring, and nearly destroyed the engine. They spent a full day in Winnemucca repairing the car and buying supplies. Jackson sent a telegram to his wife saying they were alive and still heading east. He did not mention how close they had come to dying. The deeper question is not just about two men driving across the desert in 1903. It is about what that drive represented. There were no highways, there were no gas stations. There were no roadside diners, no motels, no convenience stores. A transcontinental automobile trip was not just difficult, it was nearly impossible. The automobile industry was in its infancy. In 1903, there were approximately 8,000 cars in the entire United States, and most of them were expensive toys owned by the wealthy. Roads were built for horses and wagons, not for motor vehicles. There was no national system of road classification, no standardized signs, no government funding for paved highways. The federal government had no role in road construction. That was left to local counties, which had little money and less interest. Jackson and Crocker relied on railroad maps because there were no road maps. They navigated by asking farmers, ranchers, and station agents which direction to go. They were often given wrong directions. They were frequently lost. The car broke down so often that Crocker became an expert mechanic through necessity. He rebuilt the carburetor with a piece of wire. He sewed up a torn tire with a shoelace. He improvised parts from scrap metal. On June 12th, they reached Elko, Nevada. They had covered about 300 miles in 3 weeks. That is an average of about 15 miles per day. By comparison, a stagecoach could cover 60 miles in a day. A railroad train could cover 500. Jackson was not making good time. He was beginning to doubt whether he could finish, but there was another factor at work. Jackson had a rival. On May 25th, 2 days after Jackson left San Francisco, a man named Tom Fetch had also left San Francisco in a Packard car, aiming to reach New York. Fetch was a professional driver hired by the Packard Motor Car Company to prove that their cars were reliable. Jackson was an amateur on a $50 bet. The two men knew of each other. The race was not officially organized, but both understood that the first to reach New York would be remembered. This added a new dimension to the difficulty. Jackson not only had to survive the desert, he had to beat Fetch. And Fetch had advantages. His car was newer, his mechanic was more experienced, and he had a support crew. Jackson had only Crocker and a rifle. By June 15th, Jackson crossed into Utah. The terrain changed again. The salt flats were replaced by red rock canyons. The road was often a dry creek bed. The car bottomed out on rocks. They broke the axle near the town of Grantsville. Crocker removed the axle, carried it to a blacksmith shop, and had it welded. The weld held, they drove on. On June 20th, they entered Wyoming. The roads were better, but the weather turned. It rained for 3 straight days. The dirt roads turned to mud. The car got stuck repeatedly. Jackson and Crocker spent hours digging, pushing, and laying boards under the wheels. At night, they slept in the car, shivering in wet clothes. On June 25th, they reached Rawlins, Wyoming. They had been on the road for 33 days. They had covered less than 1,000 miles. They were behind schedule and low on money. Jackson sent a telegram to his wife asking for more funds. She wired him $500. He used part of it to buy new tires and a replacement water pump. By July 1st, they entered Nebraska. The flat plains were easier to drive across, but the lack of towns made it hard to find gasoline. They had to carry extra cans, but each can added weight and reduced the car's efficiency. They learned to ration. On July 5th, they ran out of gasoline near the town of Kearney. They walked 12 miles to a railroad depot, bought a can of gasoline, and walked back. It took them 9 hours. On July 10th, they crossed the Missouri River into Iowa. The roads improved. They began to encounter paved streets in the larger towns. The car ran more smoothly. They made better time. On July 15th, they reached Chicago. They had driven 2,500 miles. They had punctured 20 tires, broken 4 springs, replaced the engine water pump twice, and rebuilt the carburetor 3 times. But they were still running. The final leg took them across Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and into New York. On July 26, 1903, at 4:30 p.m., they drove into New York City. They had covered 3,300 miles in 63 days. They were the first people to drive a car across the continental United States. Tom Fetch arrived 2 days later. The victory was not just personal. It proved that an automobile could make the crossing. It fueled public interest in long-distance driving. It pushed the automobile industry to consider reliability and endurance as selling points. And it pressured the government to start thinking about paved roads. But the systems that failed Jackson and Crocker had not yet been built. There were no rescue services. There was no communication network. When the car broke down in the desert, no one was coming to help them. The only reason they survived was luck. The stagecoach driver happened to pass by. If he had not, they might have died. The question that lingers is not how they succeeded. It is how many others tried and failed and are not remembered. The first road trips were not vacations. They were tests. And the failures were more common than the successes. The aftermath of Jackson's trip brought a wave of copycat expeditions. Within a year, Alice Ramsey drove from New York to San Francisco, becoming the first woman to do so. By 1909, the Automobile Club of America organized the first transcontinental road race. The cars were faster. The roads were still terrible, but the idea had taken hold. The road trip was a possibility, and that possibility would reshape the American landscape, economy, and culture. But in June 1903, on a dirt track in Nevada, none of that was certain. Jackson and Crocker were alone, out of water and stranded. The engine was dead. The sun was high. The only question was whether they would walk out or wait. They chose to wait, and the stagecoach came. That is the thin line between an American first and an American failure. 6 years later, on the morning of June 9, 1909, a green Maxwell Briscoe touring car pulled away from the curb at 145th Street and Amsterdam Avenue in New York City. At the wheel was Alice Hyler Ramsey, 22 years old, a college graduate from Hackensack, New Jersey. With her were 3 passengers, 2 sisters-in-law, Nettie and Margaret Ramsey, and a friend named Alice Parker. None of them had ever driven across the country. In fact, Alice Ramsey had only been driving for about a year. She had gotten her license in 1908. She had never changed a tire on her own. The plan was to drive to San Francisco. The Maxwell Briscoe Company had offered to sponsor the trip. They wanted publicity. A woman driving across America would attract attention. The company provided the car, a Model 36 touring car, and agreed to pay for repairs and supplies along the way. Alice Ramsey would be the driver. She would also be the first woman to make the crossing, but there were problems from the start. The car had no roof. It had no windshield. The tires were solid rubber, not pneumatic. The steering was heavy. The brakes were unreliable. The engine had 4 cylinders and produced about 30 horsepower. The top speed was about 30 miles per hour on a good road, but good roads were rare. The women left New York at 10:45 in the morning. They carried a map provided by the Automobile Club of America, but the map was vague. It showed major cities and railroad lines, but not the actual roads. Roads in 1909 were not marked. There were no numbered highways. There were no gas stations. The women carried extra gasoline in cans strapped to the running boards. They carried water for the radiator and food for themselves. They also carried a shovel and a coil of rope. By the end of the first day, they had traveled only about 50 miles. They had gotten lost 3 times. They had to ask farmers for directions. The farmers were often confused. A woman driving a car was unusual. Some refused to believe she was the driver. On June 11th, they crossed into New Jersey, then Pennsylvania. The roads were dirt and gravel. The car slid in the mud. Near the town of Scranton, they drove through a creek because the bridge had collapsed. The water came up to the floorboards. The engine stalled. Alice Ramsey got out, waded into the water, and dried the spark plugs with her handkerchief. The engine started. They drove on. On June 15th, they reached Buffalo, New York. The car had developed a knock in the engine. A mechanic at a local garage diagnosed a loose bearing. He fixed it in 2 hours. The women stayed overnight at a hotel. The next morning, they crossed into Ohio. By June 20th, they were in Indiana. The roads improved. The car ran smoothly, but the heat was oppressive. The women wore long dresses and wide-brimmed hats. There was no air conditioning. They stopped frequently to drink water and cool the engine. On June 25th, they reached Chicago. They had covered about 900 miles in 16 days. The car needed new tires. The Maxwell dealer in Chicago replaced all 4. He also installed a new radiator. The women rested for 2 days. On June 28th, they left Chicago and headed west into Iowa. The roads turned to mud again. It rained for 3 straight days. The car got stuck 12 times. They had to get out and push. The men who saw them did not offer to help. Some laughed. Alice Ramsey later wrote that she felt more determined each time. On July 5th, they reached Omaha, Nebraska. The Missouri River crossing was difficult. The bridge was narrow and the planks were loose. The car's front wheel slipped off the edge. Alice Ramsey steered back onto the planks. The bridge groaned. They made it across. From Omaha, they followed the Platte River Valley west. The road was a wagon track. The dust coated everything. The women wore veils to keep the dust out of their mouths. The car's headlights stopped working. They had to drive at night without lights, navigating by the stars. On July 12th, they entered Wyoming. The landscape changed to high plains. The car began to overheat. The water in the radiator boiled away. They stopped at every farm to ask for water. Sometimes there was no water. The farmers had wells, but the water was needed for livestock. The women had to negotiate. They paid 10 cents per gallon. On July 15th, they reached Cheyenne. The car's broken spring was welded at a blacksmith shop. The welder was skeptical. He had never repaired a car before. He did his best. The spring held. On July 18th, they crossed into Colorado briefly, then into Utah. The road climbed into the mountains. The engine labored. The car's brakes began to fail. Alice Ramsey had to use the handbrake and the gears to slow down. On one steep descent, the brake pedal went to the floor. She steered into a ditch. No one was injured. The ditch stopped the car. They spent the next day in a small town waiting for replacement brake shoes. The shoes arrived by train. A local mechanic installed them. The women paid and continued. On July 25th, they entered Nevada. The desert stretched ahead. The road was a set of tire tracks in the sand. The car got stuck in soft sand twice. They used the rope to pull the car free. They ran out of water for the radiator. They found a spring, but the water was alkaline. The car's radiator clogged. They flushed it with clean water from a canteen. On July 30th, they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains. The road was steep and winding. The car's engine overheated. They had to stop every mile to let it cool. At one point, the car rolled backward down a hill. Alice Ramsey jammed the handbrake. Car stopped inches from a tree. On August 2nd, they crossed into California. The roads improved immediately. The car ran smoothly. They made good time. On August 6th, they reached Sacramento. They were less than 100 miles from San Francisco. On August 7th, 1909, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Alice Ramsey drove the Maxwell Briscoe into San Francisco. She had covered 3,800 miles in 59 days. She was the first woman to drive across the United States. The achievement was celebrated. Newspapers wrote articles. The Maxwell Company used her image in advertisements. She was invited to speak at automobile clubs. She wrote a book about the trip, but the deeper story is not just about a woman driving across America. It is about what her trip revealed about the state of American roads and the systems that did not exist. Alice Ramsey had no highway system. She had no road maps that were reliable. She had no emergency services. There was no AAA. There was no towing service. When the car broke down, she fixed it herself or found a local mechanic. When she got lost, she asked for directions. When she ran out of water, she bartered. The entire journey was an improvisation. The federal government had no role in road building. The first federal highway legislation, the Federal Aid Road Act, would not pass until 1906. The Lincoln Highway, the first transcontinental road, would not be completed until 1903. The numbered highway system would not exist until 1926. Alice Ramsey drove on paths, wagon tracks, and cow trails. The question is not whether she was brave, she was. The question is how many people were willing to endure that kind of difficulty for the sake of a road trip. In 1909, the automobile was still a novelty. Only about 300,000 cars were registered in the United States. Most were owned by the wealthy. Long-distance driving was a stunt, not a vacation. But Alice Ramsey's trip, like Jackson and Crocker's trip 6 years earlier, planted a seed. It showed that a woman could drive across the country. It showed that the car was more than a toy. It showed that roads needed to be built. The aftermath of her trip was gradual. More women began to drive. The automobile industry started to market cars to women. The road improvement movement gained momentum. By 1912, the Lincoln Highway Association was formed. By 1913, the first paved transcontinental route was marked. By 1919, the Army sent a convoy across the country to test the roads. That convoy included a young officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower. He saw how bad the roads were. 30 years later, as president, he signed the interstate highway system into law. But in August 1909, none of that was certain. Alice Ramsey arrived in San Francisco with a broken car, a sunburned face, and a deep sense of accomplishment. She had proven something. The road trip was not just for men. It was for anyone willing to endure the mud, the dust, the heat, and the uncertainty. She went home to New Jersey. She continued to drive. She lived to be 93 years old. She died in 1983, the same year the first cellular phones were released. She had seen the evolution from dirt paths to interstates. But she never forgot the green Maxwell Briscoe and the 59 days that changed how Americans thought about the road. The story of America's first road trips is not one story. It is many. Each trip was a test. Each failure or success pushed the country a little closer to the highways we know today. The people who made those trips were not planning for the future. They were trying to prove a point, win a bet, or sell a car. But their journeys built the foundation for the road trip as a national experience. The next major chapter would come in 1911 when Carl Fisher proposed building a transcontinental highway. But that is another story. For now, the year is 1909. The car is green. The driver is a woman, and the country is still waiting for its roads. At 2 in the afternoon on the 10th of September 1911, Carl Fisher stood on the steps of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He was a wealthy businessman, a tire magnate, and a showman. The Speedway was his creation, but on that day he spoke about something else, a coast-to-coast road. He called it the Coast-to-Coast Rock Highway. He wanted a gravel road from New York to San Francisco. He estimated the cost at $10 million. He proposed that private donors fund it. The idea was simple: make a road good enough for any car, anytime, any weather. At that time, no such road existed. What happened next was a campaign. Fisher recruited automobile manufacturers, tire companies, and road enthusiasts. He changed the name to the Lincoln Highway after Abraham Lincoln. The route was mapped. It followed existing wagon trails and railroad grades for much of its length. It ran through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. The total distance was about 3,300 miles. The first section of the Lincoln Highway was dedicated on October 31, 1913. The ceremony took place in a field near the California-Nevada border. A crowd of several hundred people attended. A bronze marker was placed. The road was not yet paved. It was still gravel and dirt, but it was marked. It had a name. It had a purpose. The Lincoln Highway was not a single road. It was a collection of local roads stitched together. Some sections were good. Others were barely passable. The association produced maps, signs, and guidebooks. It encouraged local communities to improve their segments. The federal government still had no role in road construction. The Lincoln Highway was a private enterprise. Between 1913 and 1915, several cross-country drives were made along the Lincoln Highway. The most famous was the 1915 Lincoln Highway Transcontinental Tour. A group of cars drove from New York to San Francisco in about 30 days. They encountered mud, dust, broken bridges, and washed-out roads. One car's axle snapped. Another's engine overheated. They had to wait for spare parts to arrive by train. The trip was a demonstration of the need for better roads. But the real change came from a different direction. In 1916, the United States Congress passed the Federal Aid Road Act. It was the first federal legislation to fund rural road construction. The law allocated $75 million over 5 years to be matched by states. The money was not enough to build a national system, but it was a start. It created a partnership between the federal government and the states. Then came World War I. Road construction slowed. But the war also demonstrated the importance of roads for military logistics. Trucks could move supplies faster than trains, but only if the roads were good. In 1919, the Army decided to test the roads of the United States. It sent a convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. The convoy included 79 vehicles, trucks, cars, motorcycles, and a mobile kitchen. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. McClure. The second in command was a young lieutenant colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower. The convoy departed from the ellipse near the White House on July 7, 1919 at 8 in the morning. The vehicles were new, the men were optimistic. The first day they covered about 70 miles, then the problems began. On July 8, the convoy reached Frederick, Maryland. The roads were paved, but west of Frederick the pavement ended. The trucks sank into the mud. The convoy had to stop and pull them out. On July 10, they crossed the Allegheny Mountains. The roads were steep and narrow. The trucks overheated. The convoy stopped every few miles. On July 13, they reached Pittsburgh. The roads were better, but the bridges were narrow. One bridge collapsed under a truck. The truck fell into a creek. No one was killed, but the truck had to be abandoned. The convoy continued west. On July 20th, they entered Ohio. The roads were a mix of brick, concrete, and mud. On July 25th, they crossed into Indiana. The roads were mostly gravel. The dust was thick. The men wore goggles. The vehicles had no windshields. They drove with their heads out the windows. On August 1st, they reached Illinois. The roads were very poor. One truck's axle broke. Another's transmission failed. The convoy waited for spare parts. On August 10th, they entered Iowa. The roads were mud. It rained for 4 days. The convoy was stuck. They had to use tractors to pull the trucks. On August 15th, they reached Nebraska. The roads were better, but the heat was intense. The temperature reached 100 degrees. The men had no air conditioning. They drank water from the trucks. On August 22nd, they entered Wyoming. The roads were gravel and dust. The convoy made slow progress. On September 1st, they reached Utah. The roads were rough. One truck caught fire. The men put it out. They lost a day. On September 5th, they entered Nevada. The roads were desert tracks. The trucks got stuck in sand. They had to dig them out. On September 9th, they reached California. Roads improved. On September 10th, they arrived in San Francisco. The convoy had covered 3,200 miles in 62 days. The average speed was about 6 miles per hour. The Army reported that the roads were inadequate for military use. Dwight Eisenhower never forgot that convoy. He wrote about it in his memoirs. He said it convinced him that the United States needed a national highway system, but he could not do anything about it then. He was a young officer. He had no power. The 1919 convoy was not the last cross-country drive, but it was the most important. It proved that the roads were not good enough. It showed that the federal government had to act. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 was followed by the Federal Highway Act of Winton. That law required states to designate a system of interconnected roads. The Bureau of Public Roads was created. The system began to take shape. In 1926, the United States numbered highway system was established. Roads were assigned numbers. U.S. Route 1 ran along the East Coast. U.S. Route 66 ran from Chicago to Santa Monica. The Lincoln Highway was assigned a number. Part of it became U.S. Route 30. The road network was still a patchwork, but it was no longer a mystery. Drivers could follow numbers and signs. The first road trips now looked different. Cars were more reliable. Roads were better. Gas stations were common. The 190s saw the rise of the auto camp. Tourists stayed in tents or cabins. By the 193s, motels began to appear. The road trip became a middle-class experience. Families packed their bags and drove to national parks, beaches, and other attractions. But the early road trips, the ones from 1903 to 1915, were different. They were tests, they were stunts, they were adventures. The people who made them were pioneers. They had no maps, no gas stations, no roadside assistance. They had only their cars, their courage, and their willingness to get stuck. Alice Ramsey's trip in 1909 was one of those pioneering journeys. So was Horatio Nelson Jackson's trip in 1903. So was the 1915 Lincoln Highway Tour. So was the 1919 Army Convoy. Each of these trips was a small piece of a larger story. That story is about how the United States built its roads, but it is also about how Americans learned to travel. The next major chapter came in 1956. President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. It created the Interstate Highway System. The law authorized $41 billion over 10 years. The system would cover 41,000 miles. It would be built to high standards. It would have limited access, grade separations, and wide lanes. It would connect major cities and military bases. Eisenhower's decision was shaped by his experience in the 1919 convoy. He had seen the consequences of bad roads. He also saw the importance of highways during World War II. The German Autobahn allowed rapid movement of troops. The United States needed a similar system. The interstate highway system was born. The interstate system transformed the road trip. Now drivers could cross the country in 4 days, not 2 months. They could travel at 70 miles per hour. They could stop at rest areas, gas stations, and restaurants. The road trip became a ritual, a rite of passage, a family tradition. But the interstate system also destroyed something. Old highways like US Route 66 faded. The small towns along them lost business. The motels and cafes closed. The road trip became faster but less personal. The adventure of the unknown was replaced by the predictability of concrete and lane markings. Today, the road trip is still popular, but it is different. Drivers use GPS, not paper maps. They book hotels online. They know exactly where they are going. The element of surprise is gone. The element of danger is reduced. The road trip has become a comfortable routine. But the story of America's first road trips is not about comfort. It is about hardship. It is about people who drove on dirt paths, who fixed their own cars, who asked strangers for water, who slept in the open, who faced the unknown. They did not know what they would find. They did not know if they would make it. They drove anyway. Alice Ramsey arrived in San Francisco on August 7, 1909. She had driven 3,800 miles in 59 days. She did not change the roads. But she changed how people thought about driving. She showed that a woman could do it. She showed that the car was a tool for freedom. She showed that the road trip was possible. The next year in 1910, another woman named Blanche Stewart Scott drove from New York to San Francisco. She did it in a car that had no windshield. She did it in 61 days. She was the second woman to drive across the country. She was applauded, but she was forgotten. The year after that, in 1911, Carl Fisher proposed the Lincoln Highway. The road was built. It was not perfect, but it was a start. The Lincoln Highway became a symbol of what the country could achieve. By 1919, the Army convoy crossed the country. It was a failure as a test of speed, but it was a success as a test of endurance. It set the stage for the interstate highway system. By 1926, the numbered highway system was in place. By 1956, the interstates were authorized. By 1970, the system was mostly complete. The story of America's first road trips is not a single story. It is a collection of stories, each with its own beginning and end. But together, they tell a larger story. They tell how the United States built its roads. They tell how the road trip became a national experience. They tell how a country of dirt paths became a country of concrete highways. And they remind us that every road trip, no matter how fast or how comfortable, begins with the first mile. The first mile was driven by Horatio Nelson Jackson in 1903. The first mile was driven by Alice Ramsey in 1909. The first mile was driven by every person who got into a car and turned the key. The road trip is not about the destination. It is about the road. And the road is made of stories. In 1926, the United States numbered highway system was officially approved at a meeting of state highway officials in Washington, D.C. The year was not a single date but a series of decisions. On November 11, 1926, the American Association of State Highway Officials published the new map. It showed national routes with numbers instead of names. U.S. Route 1 ran along the Atlantic coast. U.S. Route 66 ran from Chicago to Los Angeles. The Lincoln Highway was folded into U.S. Route 30 and other numbers. The system was not complete. Many roads were still unpaved, but the concept was now national. Drivers could follow numbers, not just stories. What happened after 1926 was a boom in road travel. Cars became more reliable. The Model T was replaced by the Model A in 1927. The engine was stronger. The suspension was better. The car could go faster and farther. Gas stations spread along the new numbered roads. By 1929, there were over 100,000 gas stations in the United States. The road trip was no longer an adventure reserved for the wealthy or the daring. It was becoming a middle-class experience, but the Great Depression began in 1919. The economy collapsed. Millions of people lost their jobs. Many families packed their cars and drove west looking for work, looking for food, looking for a new life. The road trip became a survival journey. U.S. Route 66 became known as the Mother Road. It carried families from the Dust Bowl to California. John Steinbeck would write about them in The Grapes of Wrath. The road was not a leisure drive. It was a lifeline. In 1932, the state of Pennsylvania opened the Pennsylvania Turnpike. It was the first modern limited-access highway in the United States. It had no intersections, no stop signs, no traffic lights. It was a prototype for the interstates. Drivers paid a toll. They could travel at high speed. The turnpike was a success. Other states began building similar roads. In 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt expressed interest in a system of transcontinental highways. He drew a map of 6 routes on a sketch. He gave it to the Bureau of Public Roads. The idea was studied, but World War II delayed construction. During the war, the roads were used to move troops and supplies. The military learned again that the existing system was inadequate. After the war, the United States was the richest country in the world. Cars were everywhere. In 1945, there were about 30 million cars. By 1955, there were more than 60 million. The roads could not handle the traffic. Congestion was severe. Accidents were common. The death toll on American roads reached 40,000 per year in the early 1950s. In 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed a commission to study the problem. He had not forgotten the 1919 convoy. He had also seen the German Autobahn during the war. He believed that the United States needed a national system of highways for defense and economic growth. The commission recommended a $40 billion program over 10 years. On June 29, 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. It was the largest public works project in American history. The interstate highway system would cover 41,000 miles. It would be built to uniform standards. It would have 4 lanes, median barriers, grade separations, and controlled access. It would connect every city with a population over 50,000. The federal government would pay 90% of the cost. The states would pay 10%. The money would come from a new highway trust fund funded by taxes on gasoline, diesel, tires, and other vehicle-related items. Construction began immediately. In 1957, the first segment of Interstate 70 opened in Kansas. In 1958, Interstate 5 opened sections in California. In 1960, the system had only a few thousand miles. By 1970, it had over 30,000 miles. By 1990, it was essentially complete. The interstate highway system changed the road trip in ways that could not be undone. A drive from New York to San Francisco that took Horatio Nelson Jackson 63 days in 1903 now took about 4 days. The roads were smooth, straight, and safe. Drivers could maintain high speeds. Rest areas, gas stations, and motels appeared along the interstates. The road trip became a predictable, comfortable experience, but something was lost. The old highways like US Route 66 were bypassed. The small towns along them lost their traffic. The gas stations, cafes, and motels closed. Route 66 was officially decommissioned in 1985. It became a ghost road. The road trip was now about speed, not discovery. The adventure of getting lost was replaced by the certainty of the exit sign. In 1973, the oil crisis changed the road trip again. Gas prices rose. Speed limits were reduced to 55 miles per hour. The era of cheap gas and unlimited driving was over, but the road trip survived. People drove less, but they still drove. The interstate system continued to expand. In the 1980s, the minivan became popular. Families could travel in comfort. The road trip became a family tradition. Children watched movies on portable DVD players. Parents used cruise control. The car itself became a living room on wheels. In the 1990s, the Global Positioning System, or GPS, was developed for civilian use. By the early 2000s, GPS devices were common in cars. Drivers no longer needed paper maps. They no longer needed to ask for directions. The road trip became a route on a screen. The element of surprise was further reduced. Today, the road trip is still a symbol of freedom, but the freedom is different. It is the freedom to choose a playlist, not the freedom to choose a road. The road trip is a ritual. It is a way to see the country. It is a way to spend time with family. It is a way to escape. But it is no longer an adventure in the way it was for Alice Ramsey or Horatio Nelson Jackson. How could this have happened? The answer is progress. The interstate highway system was necessary. It saved lives. It saved time. It saved money. It made the economy more efficient. It made travel accessible to everyone. But it also standardized the experience. The road trip became a commodity. It could be bought and sold. It could be predicted. The story of America's first road trips is not just about the roads. It is about the people who drove them. It is about the people who built them. It is about the people who lived along them. The road trip is a narrative. The car is a character. The highway is a setting. In 2009, a commemorative drive was organized to retrace Alice Ramsey's 1909 route. A group of women drove from New York to San Francisco in vintage cars. They followed the same general path. They encountered some of the same challenges. The roads were better, but the spirit was the same. They were remembering a pioneer. In 2013, the United States had over 4 million miles of roads. The interstate system alone covered 47,000 miles. The number of vehicles registered was over 250 million. The average American drove about 13,000 miles per year. The road trip was a daily reality for most people, but the early road trips remain remarkable. They were not just journeys, they were experiments. They were tests of technology, endurance, and human will. They proved that the automobile was more than a toy. It was a tool for changing the world. Horatio Nelson Jackson's car, the Vermont, now sits in the Smithsonian Institution. Alice Ramsey's Maxwell is displayed at the National Automobile Museum in Reno. The Lincoln Highway Association still exists. It maintains markers and maps. The 1919 Army convoy is remembered with a historical marker in Washington, D.C. The road trip is not over. It is evolving. Electric cars are becoming common. Autonomous vehicles are being tested. The road itself may change. But the desire to travel, to see, to explore, to move, that desire will not change. The road trip is as old as the human impulse to go somewhere else. On a summer day in 1903, Horatio Nelson Jackson drove out of San Francisco in a Winton. He had no plan, he had no map, he had no idea what lay ahead, he drove anyway. That is the story of America's first road trips. That is the story of every road trip since. The road is always there, the driver is always willing, the journey is always worth taking. On a cold afternoon in December 1956, the first concrete was poured for a new kind of road in Kansas. It was a segment of what would become Interstate 70 just west of Topeka. The crew worked with steam-powered pavers and hand-placed steel mesh. They were building a highway that would never have an intersection, never have a stop sign. The project was part of the largest public works effort in American history, the interstate highway system. But that first pour was also the moment the old road trip began to fade. What happened after 1956 was not just construction. It was a transformation of the American landscape. The interstate highway system, signed into law by President Eisenhower on June 29, 1956, was intended to connect every city with a population over 50,000. It would be financed by a highway trust fund, fed by taxes on gasoline, diesel, tires, and trucks. The federal government would pay 90%, the states paid 10%. The cost was estimated at $41 billion over 10 years. The actual cost would be much higher and the construction would take decades. By 1960, only about 10,000 miles of the planned 41,000 were open. Drivers who used the new interstates noticed something immediately. They could drive faster, longer, and with fewer interruptions. The old two-lane highways had required constant attention. Stop signs, traffic lights, cross-traffic, sharp curves, narrow bridges. The interstates were engineered for speed. Median barriers prevented head-on collisions. On-ramps and off-ramps replaced dangerous left turns. Rest areas allowed drivers to stop without searching for a gas station. In 1965, a young family of 4 drove from Chicago to Los Angeles on the newly opened sections of Interstate 80. They completed the trip in 3 days. In 1955, the same journey would have taken at least 5 days on U.S. Route 66. The mother later told a newspaper that the trip was less exhausting, but also less memorable. She missed the small diners, the quirky roadside attractions, the conversations with locals. The interstates were efficient, but they were also sterile. By 1970, the interstate system had grown to over 30,000 miles. The federal government began to recognize a problem. The old highways that served small towns were dying. U.S. Route 66, once called the Mother Road, lost traffic to Interstates 40, 44, and 55. Businesses along Route 66 closed. The road itself was gradually decommissioned. In 1985, Route 66 was officially removed from the U.S. highway system. It became a ghost road. But the road trip as an idea did not die. It evolved. In the 1970s and 1980s, the minivan became the standard family vehicle. Children watched movies on portable screens. Parents used cruise control. The car became a living room on wheels. But the adventure of the unknown was replaced by the certainty of the exit sign. How could this have happened? The answer is not simple. The interstate system saved lives. By separating opposing traffic and eliminating intersections, the fatality rate per mile driven dropped. The system also improved the economy. Trucks could move goods faster. Commutes became shorter. But the trade-off was the loss of the journey itself. In 1990, the National Scenic Byways program was created to preserve and promote the remaining scenic roads. The program designated roads like the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Pacific Coast Highway, and the Going to the Sun Road as national treasures. Drivers could again experience the road as a destination, not just a means to an end. In 2000, the American Automobile Association reported that the average American road trip was about 280 miles, lasting 3 days. The road trip had become a weekend activity, not a transcontinental quest, but the desire to drive persisted. In 2009, a group of women recreated Alice Ramsey's 1909 drive from New York to San Francisco. They drove vintage cars, faced broken parts, and slept in small motels. One of them said afterward, "We did it to remember that the road trip is not about the destination. It is about the road." In 2010, the first electric vehicles began to appear on American roads. The Nissan Leaf and the Chevrolet Volt offered a new kind of road trip, silent, zero emission, but limited by battery range. Early adopters planned their routes around charging stations. The road trip became a logistical challenge again, much like it was for Horatio Nelson Jackson in 1903. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic changed everything. Air travel collapsed, people avoided public transportation. The road trip saw a resurgence. Families drove to national parks, remote cabins, and seaside towns. The road became a safe bubble. In 2020 and 2021, visits to national parks increased by over 20%. The road trip was not just a tradition, it was a necessity. In 2025, electric vehicles are common. Tesla's supercharger network covers the interstate system. The future of the road trip includes autonomous cars where the driver may become a passenger. Will the road trip still be an adventure when you do not need to drive? Some say yes. The journey will always be about seeing, about moving, about being free. But the early road trips remain the foundation. Horatio Nelson Jackson drove without maps. Alice Ramsey drove without a windshield. The 1919 Army convoy drove without paved roads. They did not know what they would find. They did not know if they would make it. They drove anyway. The road trip is still that. It is the willingness to go. It is the curiosity to explore. It is the courage to be lost. The roads have changed. The cars have changed. The spirit has not. On a quiet Sunday morning in 2028, a driver in a vintage 1909 Maxwell will set out from New York City. She will follow the same path Alice Ramsey took on back roads and old highways. She will stop at the same towns, take the same photographs, sleep in the same hotels. She will be retracing history, but she will also be making her own. The road trip was never about the road, it was about the person behind the wheel, and that person is still driving. On the morning of October 17, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo. The target was the United States, along with other nations that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. That same day, gasoline prices in the United States rose by nearly 40%. The following morning, lines began to form at service stations in Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. By the end of the week, stations in several states were rationing fuel. Drivers could purchase only 10 gallons per visit. Some stations closed entirely. The road trip, once a symbol of limitless freedom, suddenly hit a wall. What happened next was not just a shortage, it was a cultural shock. Americans had grown accustomed to cheap, abundant gasoline. The average price in 1972 was 36 cents per gallon. By March 1974, it had doubled to 63 cents. But the real cost was not just money, it was time. Drivers waited hours for a few gallons. Some resorted to siphoning fuel from parked cars. Fistfights broke out at stations. President Nixon signed an emergency bill imposing a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. The law was intended to conserve fuel. It also transformed the road trip. Driving across the country now took longer. Rest stops became mandatory. The old rhythm of fast, open highways was replaced by a slower, more careful pace. By December 1973, the federal government had implemented odd-even gas rationing. Drivers with license plates ending in an odd number could buy gas on odd-numbered days, even plates on even days. The system was confusing and contentious. Many families postponed planned vacations. The American Automobile Association reported a 25% drop in long-distance driving in 1974 compared to 1970. The road trip as a ritual was in retreat. But the crisis also forced innovation. Automakers began producing smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. Japanese imports like the Honda Civic and Toyota Corolla gained popularity. In 1975, the federal government passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which established the first fuel economy standards for passenger cars. By 1980, the average new car got over 20 miles per gallon, up from about 13 in 1973. The road trip was changing shape. Drivers now planned routes around gas stations, not just scenic views. The idea of driving aimlessly became impractical. The journey needed a purpose. How could this have happened? The United States had grown dependent on foreign oil. In 1973, the country imported about 35% of its crude oil. The embargo exposed the vulnerability. The government's response was reactive, not preventive. Strategic petroleum reserves were not created until 1975. The crisis also revealed the fragility of the road trip's promise. The open road was only open as long as the fuel flowed. By March 1974, the embargo was lifted, but the damage was done. Americans had lost faith in the endless highway. The road trip began to be seen as a luxury, not a right. Some families turned to staycations. Others embraced camping as a cheaper alternative. The gas crisis of 1973 reshaped the American relationship with the automobile. It was no longer just a vehicle for adventure. It was a machine with limits, yet the road trip survived. In the late 1970s, a new generation of drivers turned the road trip into a statement. They drove Volkswagens, vans, and converted buses. They traveled to music festivals, national parks, and counterculture communes. The road trip became a form of rebellion against the system that had rationed their fuel. In 1977, the movie Smokey and the Bandit celebrated a cross-country run in a Trans Am, evading police and running on pride. The film was a box office hit. Road trip was no longer just a vacation. It was a fantasy of escape. By the 1880s, gasoline prices stabilized. The road trip returned, but it was not the same. Families now drove minivans equipped with seat belts, air conditioning, and taped decks. The journey was more comfortable, but also more predictable. The interstate system had expanded. Motel chains replaced independent lodgings. Fast food replaced diners. The road trip became a corridor of commerce, not discovery. In 1990, the first laptop navigation systems appeared, though they were crude and expensive. The road trip was slowly losing the element of surprise. By 1995, the federal government had repealed the national speed limit, but most states kept their own limits below 70 miles per hour. The road trip was faster, but also more regulated. The story of the 1973 oil embargo reminds us that the road trip is not just a product of technology. It is a product of economics, politics, and resource availability. The freedom to drive anywhere is not guaranteed. It depends on cheap fuel, good roads, and a willingness to move. When those conditions change, the road trip changes with them. Today, electric vehicles promise to break the dependency on oil, but they introduce new constraints: charging time, battery range, and grid capacity. The road trip is once again being redefined. The driver of an electric car does not stop at a gas station. They stop at a charging station, wait 40 minutes, and then continue. The rhythm is different. The adventure is technical. On a quiet Tuesday in August 2022, a man named Daniel drove his Tesla Model 3 from New York to San Francisco. He used the supercharger network, planning his stops every 200 miles. He completed the trip in 4 days. He told a journalist that the drive was beautiful, but he felt tethered to the charging map. He could not just pull over for a scenic detour without worrying about range. The road trip, he said, had become a spreadsheet. The irony is not lost. Horatio Nelson Jackson in 1903 had to plan for water, food, and fuel. He carried a rifle. He slept in the car. The road trip has always required planning. The difference is that Jackson's obstacles were physical and unknown. Today's obstacles are digital and known. The spirit of the journey is the same, but the context has shifted. In 2023, the National Park Service reported that over 90% of visitors arrived by car. The road trip remains the primary way Americans experience the nation's natural wonders, but the environmental cost is growing. The carbon footprint of a cross-country drive in a gasoline car is about 4,000 pounds of CO2. Electric vehicles reduce that, but not entirely. The road trip is still contributing to climate change. What does the future hold? The road trip will likely continue, but in new forms. Autonomous vehicles may allow passengers to work, eat, and sleep while the car drives. The road trip could become a mobile workspace. But will it still feel like an adventure? Some say yes. The journey will always be about seeing the country, meeting people, and discovering places. The act of driving may become optional, but the act of traveling is not. The story of America's first road trips is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. Every driver who sets out on a highway today is carrying forward a tradition that began with Horatio Nelson Jackson in 1903. The road changes, the car changes, the fuel changes, but the desire to move, to see what lies beyond the next hill remains constant. On a summer evening in 2026, a young couple in a restored 1914 Ford Model T will leave New York City heading west. They will follow the Lincoln Highway as closely as possible, using modern maps but seeking old-fashioned experiences. They will sleep in motels that still have neon signs. They will eat at diners that still have counter service. They will drive at 20 miles per hour, feeling every bump. They will be on the road for 2 weeks. They will come back changed. That is the road trip. It never ends. It only begins again.